So let's learn how to sew on buttons. So first of all, you're going to need your sample fabric folded in half with the seam allowance added on, just like we did for the other fasteners. This gives you a nice thick fabric to work with. You're going to need a button with holes and a shank button. I want to take a moment before I show you actually the technique, how to sew on buttons, and let's take a closer look at these buttons. So there are three main types of buttons. You have buttons with 2 holes, like this one. You have buttons with 4 holes, like this one. And then the other type is called a shank button. It does not have any holes in the top. It has a loop or some other sort of thing that you sew to or through to attach this to your garment. This is often used in military buttons and just really decorative, pretty buttons as well. So the process for sewing a button with holes is pretty much the same. And so I'm only going to do one. You can choose for yourself whether or not you want to do a 2-hole button or a full 4-hole button. I think I'm going to do the 2-hole button. As much as I love this blue 2-hole button, I want to show you a technique with the 2-hole button. So something to take into account too is to look at the side of your button. And if you notice, so since this is a flower, there's actually a bit of a divot on this side and it's flat on this side. So this tells you what is the right side of the button. And depending on the button, it may look different from different sides, so you get to decide which side you want to be facing out. Let's see if we can get it here and see. So can you tell that right here on this side, there's actually a little bit of the button that is scooped out. There's some, like a little hole or a depression going towards these holes. I'm going to use that to my advantage because when we sew on buttons, we don't just plop it on the fabric and stitch it down real tight. We actually want to create a shank. So the thread shank here, or the shank, gives space between the bottom of the button and where it is attached to for the fabric to sit underneath the button. If we didn't have a shank on our buttons, then it's not a very secure button. The fabric can't flip underneath it. So I'm going to use this little depression on this fabric as the right side of my button to use it to my advantage. So we're going to create a thread shank with this button. So now I'm ready to start sewing. I'm just going to pick, it doesn't really matter where on your sample where you put your button. I'm going to put mine there. You're going to need a double-threaded needle, and you're going to need something that you can use as a spacer. That can be like a straight pin or a toothpick. I typically do use straight pins for this because they're available. They're all over the costume shop. But for demonstration purposes, to help make things a little easier to see, I'm going to use this needle because it's really thick. And this is going to be my spacer. And I'll show you how I use this in just a moment. So with a button, I'm going to decide where I want it to sit. I'm going to take my sewing needle, come through the back side. I've already got my knot in here. And honestly, the hardest part of sewing a button is finding the hole in the first place. Come on. There it is. So I'm going to pick a hole to come through. Does not matter at all. I'm going to pull my thread through. Now, with a 4-hole button, you can go diagonally between your buttons and create a nice X. You can go side to side, and so you've got 2 parallel lines or horizontal lines. Doesn't matter. I think because I personally prefer the X on 4-hole buttons, I'm going to do an X. So now that I've taken 1 stitch into my button, it's still loose here. It can come right off. So I want to hold it down, and I want to place my spacer on top of the button, on top of that little depression that's right here. It's going to give me a bit more space. Whoop. This is the trickiest part of starting, is just holding everything where you need it to be. So I'm going to place this spacer on top of my button, hold it in place with my fingers, and then I'm going to go over the spacer into the opposite hole. Now, for the rest of sewing this button, I'm going to keep this spacer in place and make sure that my threads are completely crossing over it. So once I get going, this actually will kind of be held in place by my own stitches. This allows me to pull as tight as I want. And I'm still gonna have a little bit of wiggle room underneath the button when all is said and done. So just like other fasteners, we want to sew each set of holes at least 3 times. More is better. And again, the hardest part about sewing a button is just finding your hole on the back side. I usually don't struggle this much, but anytime that I record sewing a button or someone watches me sew a button, always harder. Okay, so I've done plenty of stitches going this direction. Since this is a 4-hole button, I do want to go through all of the holes. So I'm gonna kind of turn my spacer slightly so I can find my other set of holes. And I'm gonna go over those. For efficiency's sake, I tend to do 1 set of diagonal holes. Oop, also check your back. Make sure you're pulling your threads all the way through. For efficiency's sake, I tend to just do 1 set of cross stitches and then the other set, but you can alternate going back and forth if you want. Honestly, as long as all of your stitches go over whatever you're using as your spacer, doesn't matter. Okay, that is 3 stitches there. Let's do like 2 more just to be safe. Okay, come on, there it is. All right, so now I have done enough stitches that this is nice and secure. But I do not want to tie my knot yet because I'm gonna take this spacer out. And if you notice, you can actually kind of see the stitches stick out from the button. That allows this to push up like that. So I want to create a thread shank. So don't tie off yet. You're gonna go from the back side to underneath your button. Don't go through the hole. Just go underneath your button, just like this. Be careful that you don't pull this one too tight and make your last stitch pull the button down. So we want to ensure that all of this space that's happening above the button stays underneath. And so the way we're gonna do that is we're just gonna wrap this thread around the button nice and tight. So now we can see those threads are wrapped around, creating a little bit of a space between the bottom of the button and the fabric. This allows us, when we put a buttonhole on, for the fabric to sit nicely underneath the button. So after you go around a couple of times, you're gonna go back down through your fabric, just like this, and tie off. You need to do a thread shank on every button that you sew that has holes, because that is going to make it much more secure. I will be checking your buttons to see if you did a thread shank. Okay, I don't have quite enough thread to sew the shank button, so let me get some more thread. Okay, so I have a new stretch of thread, again, double threaded, and I'm ready to sew on the shank button. Now, shank buttons tend to be a little wobbly. There is a technique I want you to use that does help mitigate how wobbly shank buttons are, but typically they are just a little bit wobbly because they are perched on a post that actually, the post itself, let's see if I can hold this at an angle where you can see it. Post itself is a little wobbly. So it's okay if it's a little wobbly, but we are gonna try and make that a little better. So determine where on your fabric you want your shank button to start. And depending on your shank button, you may actually have a design, oops, get to focus, a design that you want to go a particular direction. So you'll wanna make sure that you place that on your fabric with the design going the direction you want. So I want it to go that way, which means my shank is actually at an odd angle. Okay, so I'm gonna do my shank right here. So we do not need a spacer for this one because it's built in. I'm gonna take 1 stitch, figure out which direction this needs to sit. I want it to go this way. I'm gonna pass my thread through the shank, just like that. and then go into my fabric. Pull this gently to make sure that my thread doesn't twist in a strange way as I get it to where I want it to be. Pull that nice and tight. Okay, so now we are gonna just come back up through. You can kind of scoop with this, it's really tricky. Shank buttons are just wibbly wobbly. So you're gonna come up through underneath your button, pass through the shank, and go back down in the same spot you did before. So what you're gonna do is as you're sewing, you're gonna end up creating an X. I'll get some lotion on my ring. You're gonna create an X with your stitches. So I am currently doing this side of the X. I'm gonna take 1 or 2 stitches this direction, and then I'm gonna switch and stitch the other way. That is the technique that helps prevent shank buttons from being quite so wobbly. So you can see underneath, it is going across the loop this direction. Come back up, go through the loop, and back down. So that's about 3 stitches this way. So I'm gonna switch and go the opposite direction now. Whoop. Watch your thread, make sure it doesn't wrap around in a weird way. So now I wanna come up over here and go backwards this direction. Hardest part about recording sewing a shank button is just getting the camera where you can see what's happening. Okay, so see how my threads now make an X underneath? That is where I want to stitch. So I'm gonna go down and pull that. Come back up. Oop. Go on the other side of the shank. And back down. So try to make an X over the shank part of the button. If it wasn't obvious, this loop is the shank. That's why it's called shank. It's one of my favorite odd sewing words because shank, yeah, we're just gonna, I'll leave that thought there of why this might be an interesting word for me. Okay, so I've taken a couple stitches that way. I'm gonna do a couple stitches the other way. Shank buttons tend to make me nervous because I want them nice and secure. So I do have a habit of trying to stitch them a lot more than necessary. So you want at least, excuse me, 5 or 6 stitches going each direction of your X. Okay, so there we go. So now you can see like the shank is still a little wobbly, but it's not too terrible. It's going to mostly stand upright. If we were just to go over the shank back and forth like this, then it is gonna roll around a bit more. Having the X prevents it from flopping around. So now that I've got it stitched, I'm gonna tie my knot. I do tend to, with buttons especially, do this knot more often than not. This knot more often than not. I tend to do this type of knot with buttons because I know that the chances of a button getting changed out in the future is a lot higher than any other alteration. Designers love to pick different buttons. Okay, so that is the techniques for sewing a button with holes and a shank button. A 2-hole button is the same as this. You put a spacer on and you just go back and forth between the 2 holes. 4-hole buttons, you can do all kinds of really cool decorative things, but honestly for theater, this X is what's used most of the time unless the designer specifically says to sew it a different way. But if someone is that close to a performer that they can tell how it was sewn on, they're too close to the performer. So that is how you do buttons.